Snow fell in silence, blanketing the world in white. And in that silence, two bear cubs sat beside their mother's lifeless body. She had shielded them from the storm, from the cold, from the hunters, but she couldn't save herself. They didn't cry. They didn't move. They just sat there, huddled together, tiny, trembling, and alone in a world that had already taken too much from them. 4 days, they waited. For her to wake up. For warmth. For something. For someone. Until one evening, they heard footsteps. A figure appeared through the blizzard, not another predator, not a hunter, a man. Covered in furs, limping, face frozen but eyes full of something they hadn't seen since she'd gone. Kindness. What happened next would defy nature. And change not only the cub's fate, but the man's own soul. The wind screamed across the mountain like a wounded beast. Snowflakes swirled in angry circles, burying everything beneath a relentless white blanket. In the heart of the storm, beneath a broken pine, lay a bear, her fur coated in ice, her sides no longer rising with breath. Beside her, 2 cubs. Tiny. Shivering. Curled so tightly into her still form they didn't notice the cold tearing at their ears. Her last warmth was all they had left. She had fought to keep them alive. Her paws were bloody from digging a shallow den, her flanks bruised from fending off a wolf pack. The storm had been the final blow. Now, the world was quiet. Cruelly, impossibly, quiet. The cubs whimpered, nudging their mother's lifeless body, hoping she would wake. That she would grunt and pull them close. But she didn't move. Not that hour. Not the next. Not for the next 2 days. Miles away, a man named Reed Olcott trudged through the same storm. He was no stranger to the cold. A former survivalist, trapper, and once renowned wilderness guide, Reed had long since turned his back on people. After the accident, the one that took his wife and daughter, he disappeared into the wild like smoke into wind. He didn't want redemption. He didn't want to be found. But now, the mountains were forcing him back to life. His food was low. His leg, injured weeks ago in a fall, throbbed with infection. He'd been walking for nearly 2 days with nothing but a hunting rifle, a hand axe, and a backpack full of regret. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought it was just a lump in the snow, a fallen tree. But something about it, how it breathed, how it trembled, made him stop. He stepped closer. 2 bear cubs, no older than a few months, nestled against a frozen corpse. Their mother. Reed's breath caught in his throat. He raised his rifle instinctively, scanning for movement. But there was no sound. No breath but the cubs. They looked up at him. Not with fear. Not with anger. But with something far more haunting. Hope. And Reed Olcott was not a man who knew what to do with hope. He should have walked away. Nature was cruel, and he'd learned long ago not to interfere. He should have let the wild take its course. But something in him, a flicker of a memory, of soft hands holding his, of a child's laugh, tightened in his chest like a fist. He dropped to one knee. The cubs didn't run. One tried to stand, legs wobbling. The other only whimpered. "Damn it," he muttered. "Don't do this to me." He slung off his pack, opened the flap, and pulled out his only thermal blanket. He wrapped it around the cubs gently, careful not to startle them. They flinched, but didn't fight. And for the first time in years, Reed felt needed. There was an abandoned firewatch cabin 5 miles west. He'd passed it weeks ago. Roof mostly intact. Shelter from the wind. He made a sling from rope and canvas, slid the cubs inside, and lifted them onto his back. Each step was agony. Snow climbed past his knees. His breath came in fire bursts. But he didn't stop. "Not today," he told the cubs. "You're not dying today." The trail blurred in the storm. But Reed didn't turn back. The fire was almost out by the time Reed got the second cub to stop shivering. He'd made it to the old firewatch cabin just before dusk, his boots soaked, hands frozen, and heart racing. He barely remembered how he'd gotten there. The door had nearly splintered in his hands. The hinges screeched like rusted screams. But inside, it was shelter. And that was enough. He laid the cubs down by the hearth on a nest of old canvas tarps and kindling. They curled into each other instantly, their bodies small, trembling, eyes half closed. Exhausted. Alive. The mother's scent was still on them. That grief clung to the air like smoke. They whimpered in their sleep, little cries that twisted something deep in Reed's chest. He'd heard those kinds of sounds before. In his daughter's nightmares. Before the crash. Reed forced his hands to work. He got the fire going with dried bark and a few stubborn matches. The cabin filled with orange light and heat. Steam lifted from the cub's fur. He boiled snow for water. Dug into his pack for the last bits of jerky. He tore it into small strips and placed it in front of the cubs. At first, they just sniffed it, confused, hesitant. But eventually, the bigger one began to chew. It gave Reed a look after the first bite. Something between confusion and gratitude. "Yeah," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "I didn't think I'd be sharing dinner either." He sat down beside the fire. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the pain in his leg. For the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. He hadn't meant to name them. But after 2 days, it just happened. The smaller one, quieter, always clinging to its sibling, he called Ash. Because of the gray on its nose. The way it always looked like it had walked through fire and come out quieter on the other side. The bigger one, bolder, braver, always the first to try eating, the first to sniff Reed's coat, he named Bran. Like the trees that lined the mountain, stubborn and strong. They began to trust him. Slowly. Carefully. Ash curled into his coat one night when the wind howled too hard. Bran snorted at him when he took too long warming water. They followed him with their eyes. They learned his voice. They knew when he was sad. Reed tried not to talk to them. But some nights, when the fire popped too loud and the silence pressed in too close, he spoke anyway. About the crash. About the highway curve he didn't see coming. About how his daughter had looked at him before the impact, not scared. Just trusting. And how he'd broken that. The cubs listened. Not because they understood the words, but because they understood the tone. Pain sounds the same in any language. On the 7th day, the peace shattered. Reed was chopping kindling outside when Bran barked, a low guttural sound. Reed dropped the axe and rushed in. Ash was gone. The door had cracked open in the wind. There were paw prints in the snow leading away from the cabin. Tiny, uncertain, vanishing into the trees. No, Reed grabbed his coat, rifle and lantern. No. Not today. He followed the tracks through knee-deep drifts. The storm was coming back. Visibility was fading. And then he saw it. Ash, cornered at the base of a rock ledge. And a wolf. Lean. Hungry. Eyes locked on the cub. Reed didn't think. He raised the rifle. The wolf lunged. Ash let out a sharp, terrified squeal. But before the animal's teeth could reach the cub, a deafening crack ripped through the air. Reed's rifle. The bullet hit the snow just inches from the wolf's feet, not to kill, but to scare. It worked. The wolf recoiled, yelped, and vanished into the trees. Reed fell to one knee, heart pounding, breath burning his lungs. He dropped the rifle and scrambled toward the cub. Ash was still there. Shaking. Unharmed. Eyes wide with the kind of fear that left scars. Reed wrapped his arms around the small, trembling body and held it close. "You're okay," he whispered. "I've got you." He didn't realize until he stood that blood was soaking through his pant leg. The stitches on his infected wound had ripped open. He was bleeding. Fast. But he didn't stop. He carried Ash in one arm, rifle in the other, and walked back into the storm. By the time he reached the cabin, Reed's vision had begun to blur. Bran rushed forward, nuzzling Ash immediately, sniffing and pawing him like an older sibling who'd almost lost everything. Reed collapsed beside the fire and tore open the emergency medkit. His fingers were numb. His breath ragged. He hadn't felt this close to death since the crash. He boiled snow for water, cleaned the wound, and stitched it back together with shaking hands. He passed out for 2 hours, maybe 3. When he woke, both cubs were curled into him. His body was in pain. But his heart, for the first time in years, felt alive. Days passed. Then a week. The storm subsided. The snow didn't melt, but the sky cleared, and with it came moments of peace. Reed taught the cubs how to drink from the water bucket. He fed them bits of trout he caught from the nearby stream. They grew stronger. Faster. Smarter. Bran learned how to open the door with his nose. Ash began climbing the furniture, toppling whatever Reed left on tables. They became a family. Not by blood, but by survival. Reed hadn't turned on the radio in weeks. But one morning, as the cubs napped near the hearth, he flipped the dial out of habit. And what he heard made his hand freeze mid-air. Repeat, this is Park Service Patrol. Be advised, 2 bear cubs believed orphaned in the eastern ridge. Mother found deceased. We're searching the valley. If spotted, do not approach. Cubs may be relocated or euthanized depending on behavior. Over. Reed stared at the radio. Euthanized? They're just cubs, he muttered. But the law didn't see bonds. It didn't see trust. It saw risk. And now, someone was coming. That night, under a full moon, Reed heard the unmistakable sound of snowshoes crunching. Someone was coming through the woods. Armed. Flashlight cutting through the trees. The cubs sensed it too. Bran growled. Ash hid under Reed's coat. Reed grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. At the edge of the tree line stood a man in a thick jacket, a badge on his shoulder, and a tranquilizer gun in his hands. "Sir," he called out. "We're looking for 2 orphaned cubs. Reports say someone may be harboring them." Reed raised the rifle, not aimed to shoot. Just held firm. "Turn around." Here's part 4 of your cinematic emotional story. The confrontation escalates. A truth is revealed. And Reed faces a moment of reckoning. Reed stood in the snow, the rifle firm in his hands. The ranger at the edge of the woods paused, one boot halfway into the clearing, flashlight lowered slightly. "Sir, I'm not here to hurt you," the ranger said. "Or the animals. But if you're sheltering the cubs, I need to know. This isn't just about you anymore." Reed didn't flinch. "They're not just animals," he said. "They've survived a storm, wolves, starvation. They've done nothing wrong." "That may be," the ranger replied calmly. "But that's not how the system sees it. Cubs raised by humans don't always return wild. Some end up in zoos. Or worse." Reed's voice cracked. "Then maybe the system's broken." Behind him, Ash whimpered. The ranger heard it. "They're with you now, aren't they?" Reed lowered the gun just an inch. His grip trembled. The ranger took a slow step forward. "Look, man, we don't have to turn this into a standoff. Let's talk inside. I'm not your enemy." Reed hesitated, then nodded. Inside the cabin, the ranger introduced himself as Eli Carter, mid-30s, quiet, respectful. He removed his gloves, looked at the cubs huddled behind Reed, and didn't move toward them. "You fed them?" Eli asked. "I saved them," Reed answered. "That too." They sat by the fire. Reed explained everything: the mother's body, the storm, the wolf, the wound, the bond. Eli listened. No judgment. Just silence. "Why didn't you call it in?" he asked softly. "Because I knew what would happen," Reed said. "They'd be taken, locked in cages, labeled dangerous. Like me." "And what are you?" Reed looked down. "A broken man. Hiding in the woods." Eli paused. Then said something Reed didn't expect. "You're also the reason they're still alive." Eli opened his pack and pulled out a form. It wasn't an arrest notice. It wasn't a warning. It was a sanctuary referral. "There's a place up north. Large. Fenced only on 3 sides. Bears raised wild get a second chance there. Not tamed. Just helped. I can't promise they'll live free. But I can promise they'll live." Reed's eyes locked on the cubs. Bran was chewing on a piece of firewood. Ash was curled around Reed's worn boot. "What happens if I say no?" Eli's face softened. "Then I walk away." And never saw a thing. Reed was silent for a long time. The next morning, Reed packed everything they'd need: blankets, water, food. He placed Ash and Bran gently into a carrier Eli had brought. They didn't resist. They trusted him too much. And maybe that made it harder. Outside the cabin, Reed knelt down one last time. Bran sniffed his face and let out a low, playful grunt. Ash licked the back of his hand. Reed tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Eli touched his shoulder. They'll remember you. Animals like that, they always do. Weeks passed. The cubs, Ash and Bran, were delivered to the sanctuary by Ranger Eli himself. Reed didn't go with them. He couldn't. Not because he didn't care, but because caring had become the hardest thing of all. He stayed behind in the cabin, watching the snow melt, waiting for silence to return. But it didn't. Instead, something new settled in its place. Peace. 2 months later, a letter arrived. No return address. Just a symbol, the pawprint of the sanctuary. Inside, a short message handwritten by Eli. They're adjusting. Bran's already climbed halfway up the feeding tower. Ash refuses to eat unless someone plays a tune nearby. I think you hummed too much by the fire. They're not just surviving. They're thriving. Thought you should know. Reed didn't cry. But his hands shook as he folded the letter and placed it next to the photo of his daughter. That summer, Reed heard something strange one morning. He stepped outside, rifle slung loosely over his shoulder, and scanned the tree line. And there, standing just beyond the brush, was a bear. Small. Familiar. Its fur slightly darker now. But the eyes, unmistakable. Ash. No tranquilizer tag. No collar. Free. It didn't approach. It didn't need to. It just looked at him, long and slow. The kind of look you give someone you never forget. Then it turned, and vanished into the trees. The cabin still stands. But behind it now is a hand-carved wooden post. On it, 3 names. Ash. Bran. Reed. And below them, a message scorched into the grain. Sometimes, the lost save the forgotten. Sometimes, the wild saves the wounded. And sometimes, kindness is the only shelter left.